This is the book that I'm going to be talking about. It's called My Old Confederate Home, a respectable place for Confederate veterans. Now, you may have seen the Confederate or heard the Confederate in the title and think that I'm going to be talking about the roar of the cannon and tactics and moving around. No, I'm not. I hope you're not disappointed. You may see on the cover here that it's got that Confederate flag on it. That's a pretty toxic image that has been up over the last couple of years, especially. It's become a pretty toxic image, and I'm kind of self-conscious about it. But let me tell you, you're not going to be hearing some South shall rise. Pardon me. You're not going to be hearing some South shall rise again, save your Confederate money, boys kind of heritage story. Instead, I'll tell you what. Let me start this way. Is there anybody here who's a military veteran of military service? Okay, and I'm sure some of you are as well. You know, the response to that is always, thank you for your service. But that really isn't enough, because in point of fact, through our entire American history, starting actually with the Pilgrims, we've made a pact with the men and women who've taken up arms on our behalf. We've said to them, you defend us, pick up arms, take up those arms in our defense, and we'll protect you. We'll protect your wives and children if anything should happen to you. We'll provide you benefit of some sort for having done this service. Early on, because they were serving, they couldn't grow corn of their own, the community pitched in and fed them all. Later, it was gifts at the end of the Texas Revolution. Those who fought for the Republic of Texas were given land grants. Today, we have a number of benefits. My dad, at the end of World War II, he put away his uniform in 1946 and never looked at it again. But throughout his life, he was able to go to college with much of that cost paid for by the U.S. government because of his service in the military. He bought a home, our first home, with lower interest rates, subsidized and guaranteed by the federal government. Dad could have gone for medical care to any of 87 veterans hospitals around the country. At the time he died, there was a plot waiting for him in a cemetery, a military cemetery, had he wanted it, for him to rest. Several weeks after he died, we received a package from the President of the United States with a folded flag saying, thank you for your relative service. So again, we provide benefits for those who take up arms on our behalf. We can hate the war, and believe me, it's a lesson I found during the Vietnam era. We can hate the war while we honor the warrior. But at the end of America's Civil War, there were 1 million men who had fought for the Confederacy, who came home to states in the South, and there were no benefits whatsoever. There was no help for them. There was no community, no government to give back to them. And in fact, the U.S. Constitution, if you read carefully, Amendment 14 to the U.S. Constitution contains a clause that says we'll make no payments for those who fought, the U.S. government will make no payments for those who fought against it in the recent rebellion. So these 1 million men came back to their homes and did the best they could to pick up their lives again, and the 4 or 5 years they'd been in the service, either through volunteering or conscription or peer pressure because everybody else in their community was going. But they picked up their lives and went back to work. It's kind of tough on some of them. Some were still carrying bullets from the war in their bodies. Some of them had one leg. How do you chop enough wood for your family for winter if you have only one arm? How do you plow a food for in your family garden if you only have one leg? How do you follow a plow? They did it. Now, from time to time, groups of veterans, Southern veterans, Confederate veterans, got together and assisted one of their comrades. In fact, as they got together at meetings, one of the favorite songs that they sang was, We've drunk from the same canteen, my friend. We've drunk from the same canteen. Never will we have friends like this who have drunk from the same canteen. So they stayed together, but again, there was no help for them. As the decades went on, the 70s, the 80s, the 1890s, there was an increasing number of homeless people on the streets of Atlanta, Nashville, Dallas, Little Rock. Throughout the South, there was a problem of homeless veterans. Now, some of these were men who could just never have adjusted to the 4 years of war. We know them now as people with PTSD. And there was no treatment for them. The levels of suicide were high. The levels of violence to their own family was high. But again, many of them just drifted without knowing where to go. There was a, pardon me, I came across a biography of a man who, and it's kind of telling, and you see this a lot if you read any era biography. Being broken up by the ravages of war, Judge J.D. Shacklet made many moves and many changes in businesses throughout the years that followed. He was never able to care for himself or his family fully. What a sad story in just those two sentences. And it happened to thousands of Confederate veterans. By the end of the century, close to the end of the century, veterans realized we've got to do something for ourselves. We got to do something. Through organizations such as the United Confederate Veterans, they began raising money state by state. This wasn't a national effort. This wasn't a statewide effort. It was a local effort. And the effort was centered on the idea that we need to build a place of refuge, a place to care for our comrades who can't care for themselves. Now understand, this is an era when independence and living off the dole were important parts of a person's character. But they recognized that there were people who just couldn't, who were too invalid, too decrepit to live by themselves. One of those men was one that I kind of got to know as I was doing research. His name was Tolliver Duncan. Tolliver spelled the southern way as if it were Taliaferro, but Tolliver Duncan, everybody knew him as Tall. Tall was known as the traveling tree man. He traveled through Tennessee and Kentucky selling fruit trees to farmers. When those fruit trees were delivered from where they were grown, he'd help the farmers, pardon me, he'd help the farmers dig them, put them in, give them advice, check with them year after year to be sure that the orchards of the fruit trees were doing well. Tall did that physical labor, traveling farm to farm, not really having a home of his own until he was 80 years old. By the time he was 80 years old, he wrote his sister saying, you know, I just get worn out doing nothing. I just can't do anything anymore. His sister and brother-in-law were worried that Tall would just die and he'd be lost forever somewhere in the forest or in the so they made arrangements to help put him into the Kentucky Confederate Home. The Kentucky Confederate Home was built in 1902, and much of this book tells the story of the Kentucky Home because it's typical of all the others. I'll tell you about the Texas Home in a minute. But Tall Duncan went into that home that was built through contributions, and again, he wrote to his sister, we old fellas here don't know when it's cold. We don't have to go outdoors for anything. The house is kept warm all the time with heaters. It was like magic to a guy who'd been living on the ground all those years. I wish you could be here to see the beautiful roses and the other flowers that are blooming now, he told his sister. This home is an earthly paradise. For many it was. Many who had no other place to go, it was an earthly paradise. And it was able to rescue people who couldn't otherwise take care of themselves. Excuse me. Texas built its own Confederate home. And that home was built in 1886 by a group of Confederate veterans known as the John Bell Hood Camp. They began taking donations, putting up money, and were able to buy a 16-acre tract with a farmhouse on it. That tract, thank you very much, that tract in Austin on West 6th Street. I don't know if you know Austin, but at about the 1600 block of West 6th Street, the property is still there. And you can see it. There's a historical marker. I was there when it was dedicated about 2-3 years ago. There's a historical marker marking it. But it was a beautiful home, and it was intended to house 10 Confederate veterans who had need of assistance. That wasn't nearly enough. And the veterans who paid for it didn't realize the costs that were going to have to be undertaken just to maintain the place. Well, an organization called the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who were wives and daughters of Confederate veterans, also began raising money. One of their big efforts was through school children in Texas. Those school children were asked to go door to door collecting pennies, and as a result, many of them, am I on the air or off?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, you're on.
Okay.
Keep going.
As a result, many of those pennies made their way to improve and maintain the Texas Confederate home. The veterans who were not living, the veterans who organized it, asked for help from the state. Would the state give these veterans who fought on the state's behalf? State said, no, we're under a Reconstruction Constitution that prevents us from giving a penny to folks like Confederate veterans. So we can't do that either. Again, the Confederate veterans themselves kept raising money and taking care of the home. By 1896, the Texas legislature said, to heck with the strictures that we have on it. We have an obligation to these people. So in contravention of its own state constitution, the state began to care for those people at the Confederate home, and it helped solidify the budget of it. That home, at its as it went on, housed up to 250 people. It became a large enterprise. There was a blacksmith shop, there was a print shop, there was a shoe repair place, there was a bakery, there were farms or farm plots for people who wanted to remain active. The philosophy was that nobody really wanted to retire. People wanted to remain active, and there were places for them to do that if they could. They did their own crafts. And I saw come up on eBay not long ago a walking stick that had been carved by one of the veterans at the Confederate home. And let me tell you, if you can find an item that was created and can be sourced to one of the Confederate homes, pick it up. That walking stick, that carved walking stick, went for close to $2,000 on eBay. So there's quite a market for it, and I've seen a few items come up. But again, what it was, and I don't want to make it sound romantic. There were some beautiful facilities. In fact, over time, there were 16 lasting homes throughout the South. They were built as early as 1878, starting in Louisiana. Texas was 1886. Kentucky's opened in 1902, and Oklahoma opened a home in 1904. The last one that opened and operated was California in 1926, housing the last dozen veterans that had relocated to Southern California. So there was a chain of homes throughout the South that operated, but they operated independently. In Texas, the state government in 1911 said there are fewer and fewer veterans to be able to contribute. The state needs to take a larger role. So the state took over the Confederate Home for Men in Austin as one of its eleemosynary institutions. Right there along with the insane asylums and the blind schools was the Confederate Home for Men. Part of the dignity went out of the home when it was state financed. Budgets went down, the blacksmith shop closed, there wasn't the extra activities that could be done. And starting then, it was kind of a sadder place in a way. And if you think about it, the whole concept of 200 men living together in one big home, is one big institution, is not a real pleasant thought, with all their smells and their noises and their needs. It had to be a pretty brutal place. And some people didn't like it. They had no other resource, but they didn't like it. What I found in looking at all the Confederate veterans' homes is there was a higher percentage of suicides there than from the population as a whole. Part of that had to do with undiagnosed mental illness, perhaps as a result of their military service, but also because of the endness of living in that Confederate veterans home. And yet, every day they went out, saluted the old flag, and wore the old uniforms. It's interesting too, and I haven't slipped this time, but I often refer to the residents of the homes as inmates. And they were, that was the common terminology. Now we have a meaning of inmate today as somebody who's imprisoned or locked up against their will. The meaning in the 19th century of inmate were, well, if you think of the word inn, as in a place where people stay, an inn, and mate, a companion. What inmate meant then were unrelated people living under the same roof. You could be an inmate of a boarding house. You could be an inmate of the one of the Confederate veterans' homes. And so, if I slip and use the word inmate, you'll know what I'm talking about. I told you there were some interesting stories there. There was a higher than normal rate of suicide, sadly, but there were also some great living stories as well. One of those that I kind of enjoyed was a man named Charles David Clark. Clark came to the home in 1931 and lived there well. He had been active, he had traveled a lot up until, but he'd become a little decrepit. He needed to go into the home, he did. But throughout his active life, he had never really had an interest in women at all. He had never married, he had never really had a close, until he met the wife of another inmate. Well, everything was respectable, everything was fine, but unfortunately that other inmate passed away in 1940. And Mr. Clark was able to woo her, and in 4 months after his compadre passed away, Mr. Clark was able to marry the woman who was living nearby the home, and by this time Clark was 93 years old. He gives hope to us, all us old guys. 93 years old, he marries the woman. It was probably a little tough for him because 6 months later he passed away, but he did pass away married, and that's only one of the enjoyable stories. Another person I came to know as I was writing this was a guy named Uriah Bell. Now, Uriah Bell was one of those who practiced crafts in the home itself. He was able to carve walking canes. He sold soft drinks. He made money from visitors at those homes. And there were plenty of visitors, people who'd come to see old veterans sit on the laps of men who'd fought the Civil War in the prior generation. But Bell had saved up enough money to pursue his dream. And his dream was to drive an automobile. Learn how to. So he spent in 1912, he spent $900 that he had saved up from living in the home to buy an automobile. He had other money to buy driving lessons. So Uriah Bell, at 90 years old, is driving up and down the streets of Austin in a car. I don't know if I'd worry more about the people on the sidewalks or the driving instructor who did that. But Uriah Bell was one of those who made the most out of living in the Confederate Veterans Home. Now, gradually the veterans began to die off, and there were fewer and fewer in real estate that was owned by the state, and the state wanted it filled up. So in 1945, they designated the property to be a mental institution for men. There were no veterans living in the home, but the state did reserve 10 beds in the home for Confederate veterans. At the time, there were only 4 Confederate veterans living in the state, but they reserved 10 beds for the, and it was a good thing they did, because in 1950, a man moved into the home who would be the final Confederate, the last to live there. He was, he moved in, excuse me just a second. His name was his name was Tom Riddle, and he moved in 1952. Riddle was, as the last other veterans passed away, Riddle found himself one of the very last. And there was a beautiful photo spread in 1955 of Thomas Riddle living in the Texas Confederate Home. It showed his room, it showed his grounds, and it's a real touching thing. Unfortunately, Mr. Riddle died of tuberculosis, of pneumonia, within about 6 months after that, and he was the last Confederate veteran to be living in the Texas Confederate Home for Men. But if you think about it, as late as 1955, there were veterans who were saluting the old flag, wearing the old uniform. They were still among us, although they were kept. They found refuge in those homes, people that wouldn't otherwise. Most of the homes began to shut down during the 30s, 40s, as the number of veterans dwindled, and the cost to keep up a home like that remained constant. There are still 2 homes that you can visit today if you care to. In 1945, the state of Oklahoma deeded their facility to the U.S. government to house patients after World War II. That home and the same building is in Ardmore. You can drive by it, and it's now housing veterans of another generation. In Biloxi, and everybody thought it was going to be completely lost after Hurricane Katrina, but in Biloxi, the old Jefferson Davis house, right on the beach, was one that was given over to the use of Confederate veterans, and it's been restored, and it's still there. If you care to see what an old Confederate veterans home looked like, it's open for tours. The homes died away, and now about all you'll see are the cemeteries where they buried them. Most of the men had no families to go back to, or they felt their community was now in the home. So the state of Texas deeded over part of the Texas State Cemetery. I don't know if you've ever seen it in Austin. Deeded it over to residents of the Texas Confederate Home for Men. There's a special section there. And if you have a chance, walk through that section and look at some of those. Now, it may be a day when Sons of Confederate Veterans group puts up those little Confederate flags, but that isn't important. What's important is that these were men who took up arms on our behalf, put their lives on the line, swore to give their last drop of blood, their last breath in defense of their home. And we owed them a debt. Part of the debt that we paid was through those Confederate veterans' homes at the end of the war. And it's a debt that should remind us today of the debt we continue to owe those who serve and served on our behalf. We provided a respectable place for them, a respectable place in Texas soil, and a respectable place in Texas history. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it. Now, I've got one or two other things. One, you may have questions about this. I don't think my Old Confederate Home is still in stock at all Barnes and Noble stores, but it's certainly available online. It's available through Amazon, and I hope you read it. If you have any questions, that's why I gave you my email address earlier. It's rusty@rustywilliamsauthor.com. Email me, and I'll be glad to send you not only information or answer your question, but I'll also be glad to send you the first chapter of my new book that's coming out in June. The book is called, in fact, here's a look at the cover. The book is called The Red River Bridge War. In 1931, Texas and Oklahoma armed up and went to war over a 2-bit toll bridge. It cut off traffic for 3 weeks across the Red River. There were Texas Rangers on the south side armed and looking north. There were Oklahoma National Guardsmen, an artillery company, armed and looking south. Travel was cut off between the two states for 3 weeks. Businesses were going, or people were going out of business because of there was no crossover between Texas and Oklahoma. There were mass meetings held at the courthouses in Sherman, Denison, and Durant. It was an interesting time. And I tell that story through the stories of the people who lived it in Red River Bridge War, the Texas-Oklahoma border battle. It'll be available, well, it's actually now available on Amazon and online locations for pre-sale, but it'll be in bookstores, I think, beginning the end of May. So if you have any questions about that, please write me as well. I'll be glad to send you a copy of the first chapter of it to show you what an interesting story it is. I want to thank you again for the honor of being able to speak in front of this group. I've spoken in front of several, and I want to thank you for that honor. Thank you for your attention.